2,117. That's how many outlaws Jake "Lightning" Hawkins had brought to justice during his legendary career as the most feared gunslinger west of the Mississippi. From dusty saloons to windswept canyons, his lightning-fast draw had become the stuff of legend, whispered around campfires and immortalized in dime novels. But that was before he traded his 6-shooters for a sheriff's badge, seeking a quieter life in the sleepy town of Redemption Creek. The sun was just peeking over the horizon, painting the sky in hues of pink and gold, as Jake stepped out onto the porch of the sheriff's office. The quiet streets of Redemption Creek were a far cry from the chaotic boomtowns and lawless territories he'd known for most of his life. Here, the only sounds were the distant crow of a rooster and the soft creak of a windmill turning in the morning breeze. Jake's weathered hands absently traced the outline of his badge as he surveyed the town he'd sworn to protect. It was a responsibility he took seriously, determined to preserve the peace without resorting to the violence that had defined his past. As he began his morning patrol, Jake nodded to Mrs. Peterson as she swept the boardwalk in front of her general store. He tipped his hat to Old Man Johnson, already settled in his rocking chair outside the barbershop. These simple interactions, so different from the tense standoffs of his previous life, brought a small smile to Jake's face. But old habits die hard. Even as he exchanged pleasantries with the townsfolk, Jake's keen eyes never stopped scanning the horizon, alert for any sign of trouble. His hand, though no longer hovering near a holster, was never far from the simple wooden billy club at his hip, a symbol of his new approach to keeping the peace. Little did Jake know that trouble was already on its way. Miles away, in the harsh confines of ironclad prison, a dozen hardened criminals were about to stage a daring escape. Their eyes were set on Redemption Creek, seeing it as just another backwater town, ripe for the taking, with a novice sheriff who'd be easy to overwhelm. They should have noticed how Jake's eyes constantly scanned the horizon, even while chatting with Mrs. Peterson at the general store. They should have wondered why his hand never strayed far from his hip, even during Sunday service. They should have paid attention to the way the townsfolk looked at him, with respect, yes, but also with a hint of awe and wariness that spoke of a man with a hidden past. Their mistake wasn't targeting Redemption Creek. Their mistake wasn't even threatening the townsfolk Jake had sworn to protect. Their mistake was giving a legendary lawman who'd faced down the worst criminals across 3 territories a reason to strap on his gun belt one last time. In Redemption Creek, some battles aren't won by those with the most guns, but by those who've spent 20 years learning how to outshoot outlaws who never see the bullet coming. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The afternoon sun beat down mercilessly on Redemption Creek, turning the main street into a shimmering mirage of dust and heat. Jake Hawkins stood on the porch of the sheriff's office, his weathered hands resting lightly on the railing as he surveyed the quiet town. The peaceful scene before him was a stark contrast to the memories that sometimes haunted his dreams. For a moment, Jake was transported back to a time when the mere mention of his name would clear saloons and send outlaws scrambling for cover. He could almost hear the echo of gunshots, smell the acrid scent of gunpowder, feel the weight of his legendary 6-shooters at his hips. The weight of his badge felt strange compared to the familiar heft of those guns, a constant reminder of the life he'd left behind. As he watched the townsfolk go about their afternoon routines, Jake's mind drifted to the day he'd decided to hang up his guns. It had been after a particularly brutal showdown in a nameless town on the Texas border. The face of the last man he'd brought to justice, a young, misguided fool who'd chosen the wrong path, still haunted him. It was then that Jake realized he wanted to prevent crime, not just punish it. He wanted to build something, not just destroy. Mrs. Peterson waved cheerfully as she bustled out of her general store, a basket of fresh bread in her arms. Jake tipped his hat, a smile creasing his sun-weathered face. This was why he'd chosen Redemption Creek, a chance to protect good people before they needed saving, to be part of a community instead of a lone wolf prowling the territories. But old habits die hard. As he greeted the locals, Jake's eyes never stopped moving, scanning rooftops and alleyways. His hand unconsciously brushed his hip, where his holster used to sit. Now, instead of a gun, he carried a simple wooden club, a symbol of authority rather than lethal force. "Mornin', Sheriff," called Tom, the young deputy, as he approached. Fresh-faced and eager, Tom was everything Jake had been before the weight of his legend had settled on his shoulders. "Anything exciting planned for today?" Jake chuckled, shaking his head. "Let's hope not, Tom. Quiet days are good days." But even as he spoke the words, a part of Jake, the part that would always be, Lightning Hawkins, itched for action. It was a feeling he tried to suppress, knowing all too well the cost of the excitement he once craved. As the afternoon wore on, Jake made his rounds through the town. He broke up a minor dispute at the saloon, helped old Widow Johnson fix her broken fence, and gave a stern talking-to some boys who were getting too rambunctious near the livery stable. It was simple work, far removed from his days of high-stakes showdowns and daring arrests, but Jake found a deep satisfaction in it. Yet, as the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the dusty street, Jake couldn't shake a growing sense of unease. It was a feeling he knew well, a sixth sense honed by years of facing down danger. Something was coming. He could feel it in his bones. That night, as Jake sat in his small room above the sheriff's office, he found himself cleaning his old revolvers. He told himself it was just routine maintenance, but deep down, he knew better. Lightning Hawkins was stirring, preparing for a storm on the horizon. Little did Jake know just how soon that storm would break, and how it would test not just his skills with a gun, but his commitment to the new life he'd built in Redemption Creek. The peace he'd found was about to be shattered, and the legend of Lightning Hawkins would be reborn in fire and gun smoke. The telegraph operator's frantic knocking shattered the afternoon calm of the sheriff's office. Jake looked up from his paperwork, instantly alert. Years of honed instincts kicked in, his body tensing for action before his mind had even processed. The reason... "Sheriff Hawkins," the young man gasped, out of breath and wide-eyed with panic. "Urgent message from the governor's office." Jake took the telegram, his eyes narrowing as he read the hastily scrawled words. 12 dangerous criminals escaped. Ironclad prison. Stop. Believed heading west towards Redemption Creek. Stop. Extremely dangerous. Stop. Additional forces en route. Stop exercise. Caution. Stop. A chill ran down Jake's spine, not from fear, but from a long-dormant instinct awakening. He had known something was coming, had felt it in his bones. Now the storm was upon them. He turned to his deputy, Tom, who was watching with a mix of curiosity and apprehension. "Tom, gather the town council. Emergency meeting in 1 hour. And keep this quiet for now. No need to start a panic." As Tom rushed out, Jake moved to his desk and unlocked the bottom drawer. Inside lay the gun belt he had sworn never to wear again. The leather was still supple, the revolvers gleaming as if they had been waiting for this moment. Jake lifted the belt, feeling its familiar weight settle on his hips. For a moment, he was Lightning Hawkins again, the most feared lawman in the West. But as he caught his reflection in the office window, Jake saw not the legendary gunslinger, but a man torn between two worlds. The badge on his chest seemed to weigh heavier than ever, a reminder of the responsibility he bore to this town and its people. An hour later, the town hall was buzzing with worried whispers. The council members, along with a few of the town's most prominent citizens, had gathered, their faces etched with concern. Jake stood before them, his presence commanding silence. "Folks," he began, his voice steady and calm, "I won't sugarcoat this. We've got trouble coming. 12 escaped prisoners, hard cases all of them, are headed our way." The room erupted in panicked murmurs. Jake raised his hand, quelling the noise with a gesture that spoke of years of command. "Now I know you're scared, but I swore an oath to protect this town, and that's exactly what I aim to do. We've got time to prepare, and if we work together, we can weather this storm." Mayor Thompson, a portly man with a nervous disposition, spoke up. "But Sheriff, surely we should evacuate, send for the army." Jake shook his head. "By the time help arrives, it'll be too late, and evacuation would just spread panic. No, we stand our ground. This is our home, and we're going to defend it." The meeting continued. Jake outlined his plans for fortifying the town. Barricades would be erected at key points, volunteers organized into watch groups, and emergency protocols established. But in the back of his mind, a voice whispered that diplomacy and defense might not be enough. The gunslinger in him knew that when outlaws came calling, sometimes the only language they understood was hot lead and cold steel. As the council members filed out, each tasked with specific preparations, Jake felt the weight of their expectations on his shoulders. They were looking to him not just as their sheriff, but as the legendary Lightning Hawkins. He had to be both now, the protector and the warrior. Outside, the wind had picked up, carrying with it the scent of rain. A storm was coming, both literally and figuratively. As Jake stepped onto the porch of the town hall, he saw dark clouds gathering on the horizon. The peaceful life he had built in Redemption Creek was about to be tested. The question that gnawed at him was not whether he could face down these outlaws, but whether he could do it without becoming the man he had tried so hard to leave behind. The storm was coming to Redemption Creek, and Jake, Lightning Hawkins, would be ready, but at what cost to the man he had become and the town he had sworn to protect. The next few days in Redemption Creek were a flurry of activity that transformed the quiet town into a fortified stronghold. Jake oversaw every aspect of the preparations, his military precision and strategic mind coming to the forefront as he organized the townspeople. He may have left his gunslinger days behind, but the tactical skills that had kept him alive through countless showdowns now served to protect an entire community. Dawn broke on the first day of preparations to find Jake already hard at work. He stood in the center of Main Street, surrounded by a group of bleary-eyed but determined volunteers. "All right, folks," he called out, his voice carrying the authority of years of command. "We've got a lot of work ahead of us. Johnson, I want you and your boys to start on the barricades. Use anything you can, wagons, barrels, furniture if you have to. Tom, organize a group to reinforce the doors and windows of key buildings. Martha, we'll need a medical station set up in the church basement." As the townspeople dispersed to their tasks, Jake felt a tug on his sleeve. He looked down to see Sarah, the young daughter of the town's blacksmith. "What about me, Sheriff?" she asked, her eyes wide with a mix of fear and determination. "How can I help?" Jake knelt down to her level, his voice softening. "Sarah, you've got one of the most important jobs of all. I need you to help keep spirits up. Can you organize the other children to make signs, maybe some flags? Show those outlaws that Redemption Creek isn't afraid." Sarah's face lit up with purpose, and she dashed off to gather her friends. Jake watched her go, a mix of pride and concern in his heart. These were the people he was fighting for, not just to protect their lives, but their innocence, their hope. As the day wore on, Jake moved from group to group, offering guidance, encouragement, and when needed, a firm hand. He helped the men position makeshift barricades at key intersections, advised on the best materials for reinforcing doors, and even lent his strength to moving heavy furniture. By midday, the transformation was already visible. Redemption Creek no longer looked like a peaceful frontier town. Barricades blocked the main approaches, windows were boarded up, and lookout posts had been established on the tallest buildings. As Jake inspected the newly reinforced door of the bank, he was approached by Martha, the schoolteacher. Her usually neat hair was disheveled, and worry lines creased her forehead. "Sheriff," she called, her voice tinged with concern. "What about the children? Should we send them away? Surely it's not safe for them here." Jake shook his head, his eyes scanning the street as he spoke. "No, Martha. Splitting up families now would do more harm than good. We'll use the school as a safe house. It's solid stone and easy to defend. Plus, having the children here will remind everyone what we're fighting for." Martha nodded, visibly relieved. "You're right, of course. I'll start preparing the school right away." As she hurried off, Jake allowed himself a moment of reflection. He watched the people of Redemption Creek, many of whom had never held anything more dangerous than a broomstick, now learning basic firearm safety from Tom. The change in the townsfolk was palpable. Fear was still present in their eyes, but there was determination too. They were no longer just civilians. They were becoming defenders of their home. In the sheriff's office, Jake pored over maps of the surrounding area, marking likely approach routes and potential ambush points. His mind raced through scenarios, always 3 steps ahead. The skills that had once made him a feared gunslinger were now being put to use in a different way, planning the defense of an entire town. "You really think we can hold them off, Sheriff?" Tom asked, worry clear in his young voice as he studied the maps over Jake's shoulder. Jake looked up, his steely gaze meeting Tom's uncertain one. "Son, I've faced worse odds and come out on top. But it's not about me anymore. It's about all of us working together. That's something those outlaws won't be expecting." As evening approached, Jake stood at the edge of town, watching the sun sink below the horizon. In the dying light, his hand unconsciously traced the grip of his revolver. The weight of responsibility settled on his shoulders, heavier than any gun belt he'd ever worn. He thought about the people of Redemption Creek, how they'd come together in the face of danger. Shopkeepers who'd never thrown a punch were now learning hand-to-hand combat. The ladies' sewing circle had transformed into an efficient team producing bandages and medical supplies. Even old man Johnson, who could barely walk without his cane, had taken up a position as a lookout in the church tower. Jake's reverie was interrupted by the sound of approaching footsteps. He turned to see Martha, her arms full of papers. "Sheriff," she said, slightly out of breath, "I've got the lists you asked for. Every able-bodied person in town, their skills, and where they'll be stationed." Jake took the papers, nodding appreciatively. "Thank you, Martha. This will help more than you know." As Martha turned to leave, she hesitated. "Sheriff, Jake, are we going to be all right?" Jake met her gaze, seeing the fear she was trying so hard to hide. He placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "Martha, I can't promise it'll be easy, but I can promise you this. As long as I'm breathing, I'll do everything in my power to keep this town and its people safe." Martha managed a small smile before hurrying back towards the town center. Jake watched her go, feeling the weight of his words. He had made a promise, and Lightning Hawkins had never broken a promise. As night fell, Jake made one final round of the town's defenses. Redemption Creek was as ready as it could be. Barricades were in place, lookouts were posted, and every citizen knew their role. Now all they could do was wait and pray that it would be enough. In the quiet of his office, Jake cleaned his revolver one last time, each movement practiced and precise. As he worked, he reflected on the journey that had brought him here. From a feared gunslinger to a small-town sheriff, and now to the last line of defense for a community that had placed their trust in him. The coming days would test not just his skill with a gun, but his ability to lead, to inspire, and to protect. As he holstered his weapon, Jake Hawkins made a silent vow. Whatever came, he would face it not as the lone wolf he once was, but as part of something greater, a community united in the face of danger. Redemption Creek was ready. And so was he. The sound of galloping hooves shattered the tense silence that had fallen over Redemption Creek. Jake's head snapped up, his hand instinctively moving to his holster. From his vantage point on the church bell tower, he spotted a lone rider approaching. At breakneck speed, "Tom," Jake called down to his deputy. "Rider coming in from the east. Looks like old man Johnson from the cattle ranch." Jake descended the tower with practiced ease, his movements fluid and controlled. He reached the street just as Johnson's horse skidded to a stop, foam flecking its mouth. "Sheriff!" Johnson gasped, his face pale with fear and his clothes caked with dust from the hard ride. "They're coming! I saw them at the ridge overlooking my property. At least 12 men, heavily armed." Jake's mind raced, calculating distances and times. The ridge was less than an hour's ride from town. They had precious little time to prepare. "Did they see you, Hank?" Johnson shook his head, still trying to catch his breath. "Don't think so. I hightailed it out of there as soon as I spotted them. They were setting up camp. Looked like they were planning to move at first light." Jake nodded, his decision made in an instant. "Tom, sound the alarm. Get everyone to their designated positions. Hank, stable your horse and get to the safe. House, you've done well, but now it's time to let us handle this." As the town bell began to toll, its urgent peals echoing through the streets, Jake strode purposefully towards the edge of town. He could hear the scrambling of feet and the slamming of doors as the townspeople rushed to their posts. The plan they had drilled for days was now being put to the test. Jake took up position behind a barricade at the town's entrance, his trusted Winchester rifle in hand. Next to him, the blacksmith and the barber crouched nervously, clutching their own weapons. Jake could see the fear in their eyes, but also the determination to protect their homes and families. "Remember," Jake said softly, his voice carrying to all within earshot, "we're not looking for a fight. If we show them we're prepared, they might just ride on by. But if it comes to it, aim for the horses first. A man on foot is a lot less dangerous than one on horseback." As the sun dipped lower, casting long shadows across the empty street, the first sounds of approaching horses reached their ears. Jake took a deep breath, steadying his nerves. This wasn't his first rodeo, but it was the first time he had been responsible for so many lives. "Steady now," he murmured, as much to himself as to his impromptu defenders. "Let them make the first move." The riders appeared on the horizon, silhouetted against the setting sun. Jake counted 12 of them, just as Johnson had reported. They were rough-looking men, their faces hard and their eyes cold. At their head rode a giant of a man, his face hidden beneath a wide-brimmed hat. As they approached the barricade, Jake stood, his movement deliberate and unhurried. He stepped out, into the street alone, his hands clearly visible and away from his weapons. "That's far enough, gentlemen," he called out, his voice carrying the quiet authority that had made him legend. The lead rider reined in his horse, the others following suit. For a moment the only sound was the snorting of horses and the creak of leather. Then the leader spoke, his voice a gravelly rumble. "Well, well," he drawled, pushing back his hat to reveal a face crisscrossed with scars. "Looks like this little town's got some fight in it after all." Jake's hand rested casually near his holster, ready to draw in an instant if needed. "Name's Jake Hawkins. I'm the sheriff here. Now I reckon you boys have had a long, hard ride. Why don't you turn around and find somewhere else to rest up?" A ripple of uneasy muttering passed through the outlaws. Jake caught fragments of whispered conversation. Hawkins, not Lightning Hawkins, and knew his reputation had preceded him. The moment of truth had arrived. Redemption Creek was about to face its greatest test, and Jake, Lightning Hawkins, was all that stood between the town and certain destruction. The next few moments would determine whether blood would be spilled on the streets of Redemption Creek, or if the legend of Lightning Hawkins would be enough to turn aside the tide of violence. Jake's fingers twitched, ready to draw if necessary. But he hoped, for the sake of the town and for his own conscience, that words would be enough to win this battle. The tension in the air was palpable as Jake Hawkins stood face to face with the leader of the escaped convicts. The setting sun cast long shadows across the dusty street, giving the scene an eerie, almost theatrical quality. Behind the barricades, the people of Redemption Creek held their breath, their fingers tight on their weapons. The leader's eyes narrowed as he studied Jake. "You expect us to believe the great Lightning Hawkins is playing sheriff in this dust bowl? Boys, I think we're being played," Jake sighed inwardly. He'd hoped his name alone might be enough to turn them away, but he should have known better. Men like these, they always wanted to test the legend for themselves. "Believe what you want," Jake replied, his voice cool and steady. "But this town is under my protection. You've got two choices. Ride away now, or I start taking notches out of my gun belt." A tense silence followed his words. Jake could feel the eyes of the townspeople on him, their fear mixing with a growing hope. He had promised to protect them, and now was the moment of truth. The leader leaned forward in his saddle, a cruel smile playing on his scarred lips. "You're outnumbered, Sheriff. Even if you are who you say you are, you can't take all of us." Jake's voice was cold as steel when he responded. "Want to bet your life on that?" For a long moment neither side moved. The only sound was the soft whisper of the wind and the nervous shuffling of horses' hooves. Jake's hand hovered near his holster, ready to draw in the blink of an eye if needed. Then, with a growl of frustration, the leader yanked his horse's reins, wheeling the animal around. "This ain't over, Hawkins," he snarled. "We'll be back, and next time we won't be asking nice." As the outlaws rode away, a cheer went up from behind the barricades. But Jake's face remained grim. He knew this was just the opening move in a dangerous game. The real battle for Redemption Creek was yet to come. Once the riders were out of sight, Jake turned to address the town. "Good work, everyone, but don't celebrate just yet. They'll be back, and next time they won't be so easily deterred. Double the watch tonight, and at first light we start reinforcing our defenses." As the townspeople dispersed, Jake felt a hand on his shoulder. It was Martha, the schoolteacher, her eyes shining with a mixture of fear and admiration. "That was incredible, Sheriff," she said softly. "The way you stood up to them. I've never seen anything like it." Jake managed a small smile. "It's not over yet, Martha, but we've shown them we're not an easy target. That counts for something." As night fell over Redemption Creek, Jake found himself unable to rest. He paced the streets, checking and rechecking their defenses, his mind racing with strategies and contingencies. He knew the outlaws would return, and next time they wouldn't be swayed by words alone. In the quiet hours before dawn, Jake climbed to the top of the church tower, surveying the sleeping town below. The peaceful scene belied the danger that lurked just beyond the horizon. As he watched the first hints of light appear in the east, Jake made a silent vow. No matter what came, no matter the cost to himself, he would protect these people. Lightning Hawkins had been a legend, a lone wolf who answered to no one. But Jake Hawkins, sheriff of Redemption Creek, was part of something bigger. He was the shield that stood between this community and those who would do it harm. As he descended the tower, Jake's resolve was set. The coming day would bring violence, he was sure of it. But it would also bring a reckoning. The outlaws thought they were dealing with a washed-up gunslinger playing at being sheriff. They were about to learn just how wrong they were. The legend of Lightning Hawkins was about to be reborn, not in the name of personal glory, but in defense of a town that had placed its trust in him. And heaven help anyone who stood in his way. As night fell over Redemption Creek, an uneasy quiet settled on the town. The initial elation of turning away the outlaws had faded, replaced by a tense anticipation of what the new day would bring. Jake knew the reprieve was temporary, but it gave them valuable time to prepare. In the dim light of oil lamps, Jake gathered the townsfolk in the church, its sturdy walls offering a sense of security that belied the danger lurking just beyond the town's borders. The pews were filled with anxious faces. All turned towards Jake as he stood at the pulpit, a place usually reserved for Sunday sermons now serving as a war room. "They'll be back," Jake said, his voice carrying to the back pews. "And next time, they won't be deterred so easily. We've shown them we're not an easy target, but that just means they'll come at us harder." A murmur of fear rippled through the crowd. Tom, the young deputy, raised his hand tentatively. "Sheriff, why don't we just send for the army? Surely they could help." Jake shook his head, his expression grim. "By the time help arrives, it'll be too late. We're on our own, folks, but that doesn't mean we're helpless. We've prepared for this, and we'll face it together." He outlined his plan, assigning roles and positions. The blacksmith and his apprentices would work through the night, crafting makeshift armor and reinforcing their weapons. The women, led by Martha, would prepare medical supplies and food rations. Every able-bodied man and woman would take shifts on watch, ensuring the town was alert around the clock. As the meeting dispersed, Jake noticed young Billy, no more than 12, looking up at him with wide eyes, full of a mixture of fear and admiration. "Is it true, Sheriff?" Billy asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "Are you really Lightning Hawkins?" Jake knelt down, meeting the boy's gaze. "I was, son, but now I'm just the sheriff of Redemption Creek, and that's a responsibility I take very seriously. Will you teach me to shoot like you?" Billy's eyes shone with admiration. Jake placed a hand on the boy's shoulder, his voice gentle but firm. "Tell you what, Billy, you help your ma and stay safe. That's the best way you can help right now. Being a hero isn't about how fast you can draw a gun. It's about protecting those who can't protect themselves." As Billy ran off, Jake felt the weight of responsibility settle heavier on his shoulders. He'd sworn off violence, seeking a quieter life, but now, to protect these people, he might have to become the man he once was. The thought both exhilarated and terrified him. Throughout the night, Jake patrolled the silent streets, checking on the watchers, offering words of encouragement and fine-tuning their defenses. The town was as ready as it could be, but Jake couldn't shake the feeling that it might not be enough. As dawn broke, painting the sky in hues of pink and gold, Jake found himself standing at the edge of town, gazing out at the horizon. The beauty of the sunrise stood in stark contrast to the violence he knew was coming. "Quite a view," came a voice from behind him. Jake turned to see Martha approaching, carrying 2 steaming cups of coffee. "Thank you," Jake said, accepting the cup gratefully. "You should be resting, Martha. It's going to be a long day." Martha shook her head, a sad smile on her face. "I don't think any of us could sleep, Sheriff, not knowing what's coming." They stood in companionable silence for a moment, sipping their coffee and watching the sun rise. Finally, Martha spoke again, her voice barely above a whisper. "Are we going to survive this, Jake?" Jake turned to her, seeing the fear she was trying so hard to hide. He wanted to reassure her, to promise that everything would be all right, but he had never been one for false comfort. "I can't promise you that, Martha," he said softly. "What I can promise is that I'll do everything in my power to protect this town and its people. And I'm not alone in that. Every person here has shown more courage than I ever expected. Together we stand a chance." Martha nodded, squaring her shoulders. "Well then, Sheriff, we'd best get to it. Those outlaws won't know what hit them." As Martha walked back into town, Jake allowed himself a small smile. The people of Redemption Creek had surprised him with their resilience and determination. They weren't just relying on him to save them, they were standing up to protect themselves and each other. The smile faded as Jake spotted a dust cloud on the horizon. They were coming. "To your positions," Jake called out, his voice carrying across the town. "Remember your training. We're not just fighting for ourselves, we're fighting for our home." As the townspeople rushed to their assigned posts, Jake drew his revolver, checking it one last time. The familiar weight in his hand brought back a flood of memories, gunfights, showdowns, the thrill of the draw. But this was different. This time, he wasn't fighting for glory or reputation. He was fighting for something far more important. Jake took up his position at the center of town, his eyes fixed on the approaching riders. The legend of Lightning Hawkins was about to be put to the test, not as a lone gunslinger, but as the protector of an entire community. The battle for Redemption Creek was about to begin. The pre-dawn stillness was shattered by the crack of gunfire. Jake bolted upright, his hand already on his revolver. He was out the door of the sheriff's office in seconds, barking orders to the night watch. "They're coming in from the south," Tom yelled, running up to Jake. "At least 20 of them." Jake's mind raced. 20. Their numbers had grown. "Sound the alarm, Tom. Get everyone to their positions." As the town bell began to toll, its urgent peals cutting through the morning, mist, Jake sprinted towards the southern barricade. The air was filled with the whistling of bullets and the shouts of men. Through the dim light, he could see the outlaws advancing, using the cover of boulders and scrub brush. "Hold your ground," Jake shouted to the defenders, his voice steady and commanding. "Don't waste your shots. Wait until you have a clear target." He raised his Winchester, took careful aim, and fired. An outlaw fell, clutching his shoulder. Jake's shot had been precise, wounding, not killing. He still hoped to end this without unnecessary bloodshed. But the outlaws showed no such restraint. Their bullets splintered wood and shattered windows. A cry of pain told Jake that one of the townspeople had been hit. "Martha!" he called to the schoolteacher who was serving as a medic. "We've got wounded at the south barricade." As Martha rushed to help, Jake assessed the situation. The outlaws' superior numbers were starting to tell. They were pushing forward, and the town's defenses were beginning to buckle. Jake knew he had to act. It was time to remind these men why he had been the most feared gunslinger in the West. "Tom!" he shouted. "Cover me!" Before anyone could stop him, Jake vaulted over the barricade. His gun seemed to materialize in his hands as he charged towards the outlaws' position. What followed would be talked about in Redemption Creek for years to come. Jake moved like lightning, his shots ringing out with deadly accuracy. Outlaws fell left and right, most with non-lethal wounds that took them out of the fight. Jake was a blur of motion, dodging bullets with an almost supernatural grace. His every movement was deliberate, each shot calculated for maximum effect. With minimal loss of life, the assault faltered as the outlaws, faced with this whirlwind of gunfire, began to fall back. But Jake knew this was just the beginning. The real test was yet to come. As the gunfire died down, Jake made his way back to the barricade. The defenders looked at him with a mixture of awe and fear. They had heard the stories of Lightning Hawkins, but seeing him in action was something else entirely. "Sheriff," Tom said, his voice shaky, I've never seen anything like it." Jake nodded grimly. "Let's hope you never have to again. But this fight's far from over. They'll be back, and they'll be angry." As if to punctuate his words, a rifle shot rang out from the hills. The bullet kicked up dust at Jake's feet, a warning shot. "Everyone inside!" Jake ordered. "They're not done yet." From the shelter of the sheriff's office, Jake watched as riders appeared on the ridge. At their head was the scarred leader, his face twisted with rage. "Hawkins!" The man's voice boomed across the distance. "You've had your fun. Now it's our turn. We're giving you 1 hour. Send out all your valuables and we'll leave peacefully. Refuse, and we'll burn this town to the ground." Jake's mind raced. He knew the outlaws would make good on their threat, but giving in would only delay the inevitable. "What are we going to do, Sheriff?" Martha asked, fear evident in her voice. Jake looked around at the faces of the townspeople, scared but trusting in him. He made his decision. "We fight," he said simply. "We've shown them we're not easy prey. Now we show them the price of threatening our home." As the town prepared for the next assault, Jake knew that the coming battle would define not just the fate of Redemption Creek, but his own soul. The gunslinger he'd tried to leave behind was resurging, and he wasn't sure he could put that ghost to rest again. The clock was ticking. In less than an hour, hell would rain down on Redemption Creek, and Jake, Lightning Hawkins, would be the only thing standing between his people and annihilation. As the sun rose over Redemption Creek, the full extent of the night's battle became clear. The southern edge of town was a mess of splintered wood and broken glass. Bullet holes pockmarked buildings, and the air was thick with the acrid smell of gunpowder. Jake moved through the aftermath, checking on his people. The toll had been high, 3 townspeople wounded, though thankfully none critically. The outlaws had fared worse, with over a dozen of their number nursing injuries. "You did it, Sheriff," Tom said, awe in his voice. "You drove them off." Jake shook his head grimly. "For now, Tom, but they'll be back, and they'll be angry." As if to punctuate his words, a rifle shot rang out from the hills. The bullet kicked up dust at Jake's feet, a warning shot. "Everyone inside," Jake ordered. "They're not done yet." From the shelter of the sheriff's office, Jake watched as riders appeared on the ridge. At their head was the scarred leader, his face twisted with rage. "Hawkins!" The man's voice boomed across the distance. "You've had your fun. Now it's our turn. We're giving you 1 hour. Send out all your valuables and we'll leave peacefully. Refuse, and we'll burn this town to the ground." Jake's mind raced. He knew the outlaws would make good on their threat, but giving in would only delay the inevitable. "What are we going to do, Sheriff?" Martha asked, fear evident in her voice. Jake looked around at the faces of the townspeople, scared but trusting in him. He made his decision. "We fight," he said simply. "We've shown them we're not easy prey. Now we show them the price of threatening our home." As the town prepared for the next assault, Jake knew that the coming battle would define not just the fate of Redemption Creek, but his own soul. The gunslinger he'd tried to leave behind was resurging, and he wasn't sure he could put that ghost to rest again. Jake gathered the townspeople in the church once more. "I won't lie to you," he said, his voice steady. "What's coming will be worse than anything we've faced. But remember, we're fighting for our homes, our families. That gives us strength they can't match." He outlined his plan, a desperate gambit that hinged on his own skills and the courage of the townspeople. As the church bell tolled the hour, Jake took his position at the center of the main street. Behind him, the town was eerily quiet, seemingly deserted. The outlaws appeared on the ridge, their numbers swelled to nearly 30. Their leader rode forward, a cruel smile on his scarred face. "Time's up, Hawkins," he shouted. "Where's our payment?" Jake stood alone, his hands hovering near his holsters. "Here's your payment," he called back. "Turn around and ride out, or I start putting holes in you and your men." The outlaw leader laughed. "It's just you, old man. Your precious townspeople have abandoned you." Jake's eyes narrowed. "Then come and get me." What happened next would become legend in the West. As the outlaws charged, Jake's hands moved in a blur. His first 2 shots unseated the leader and his lieutenant. The next volley took down 4 more, but Jake was just the bait. As the outlaws focused on him, the townspeople sprang their trap. From windows and rooftops, a hail of gunfire erupted. Bottles of flaming oil, courtesy of the saloon, rained down, creating a wall of fire that split the outlaws' forces. In the chaos, Jake was everywhere at once, his guns never seeming to empty. He moved with a fluid grace that belied his age, each shot finding its mark. The battle raged for what seemed like hours, but was over in minutes. When the smoke cleared, the remaining outlaws were in full retreat, leaving their wounded behind. As the townspeople emerged from their hiding spots, a cheer went up. They had done it. Redemption Creek had stood against the storm and emerged victorious. But for Jake, the real battle was just beginning. As he holstered his smoking guns, he knew he would have to face the man he had become once more, the legendary gunslinger he had tried so hard to leave behind. The day after the battle dawned quiet over Redemption Creek. The town, battered but unbroken, slowly came to life as people emerged from their homes to survey the damage. The scars of the fight were visible everywhere: bullet-riddled buildings, overturned wagons, and the somber faces of those who had seen violence up close for the first time. Jake stood in the middle of Main Street, his eyes taking in the bullet holes and scorched earth. The cost had been high, but they had prevailed. His gaze lingered on the faces of the townspeople, a mixture of relief, pride, and something else, a new respect tinged with a hint of fear. "Sheriff," Tom called, approaching with a telegram in hand. "Word from the governor. The army's on its way to round up the prisoners and secure the area." Jake nodded, a wry smile on his face. "Bit late to the party, aren't they?" As the townspeople began the process of cleaning up and rebuilding, Jake found himself the center of attention. Eyes followed him wherever he went, filled with a mixture of awe, gratitude, and a hint of wariness. "You saved us all, Sheriff," Martha said, tending to a minor wound on his arm. "If you hadn't been here—" Jake cut her off gently. "It wasn't just me, Martha. Every person in this town played their part. You all found a courage you didn't know. You had." But even as he spoke the words, Jake felt the weight of his actions settling on him. The speed and precision with which he had dispatched the outlaws had awakened something he had long tried to suppress. The gunslinger was still there, just beneath the surface. Later that evening, as the sun set on the first peaceful night in days, Jake sat alone on the porch of the sheriff's office. He stared at his hands, calloused and steady, instruments of both justice and violence. In his mind's eye, he could still see them moving with lightning speed, dealing death and injury with terrifying efficiency. Tom approached, hesitating before speaking. "Sheriff, are you all right?" Jake looked up, seeing the concern in the young deputy's eyes. "Just thinking, Tom, about the price of peace and the weight of the badge." Tom sat down next to Jake, his young face etched with a mix of admiration and uncertainty. "I've never seen anything like what you did out there, Sheriff. It was incredible." Jake sighed, his eyes distant. "Incredible, maybe, but at what cost, Tom? I came here to leave that life behind, to be more than just a gun. And now—" His words trailed off as he saw a figure approaching in the gathering. Darkness. It was Samuel Hawkins, his younger brother and a U.S. Marshal. Jake stood, surprise and wariness mingling in his expression. "Quite a story you're making for yourself, Jake," Samuel said, leaning against the porch railing. "Thought you were done with all this." Jake's jaw tightened. "I didn't have a choice, Sam. These people needed protection." Samuel's eyes narrowed. "And now? Now that they've seen what you can do, what Lightning Hawkins is capable of? You think they'll ever see you as just their sheriff again?" The question hung in the air, unanswered. As Samuel left, Jake was left to ponder the truth in his brother's words. He had taken up the badge to leave his violent past behind, to be a protector rather than a warrior. But in saving Redemption Creek, had he sacrificed the very peace he sought? The next few days were a blur of activity. The army arrived, rounding up the captured outlaws and securing the area. Reporters from as far as Chicago descended on the town, eager to tell the tale of the gunslinger-turned-sheriff who had single-handedly saved a town. Jake found himself besieged by questions and admiring glances. He deflected as best he could, always emphasizing the bravery of the townspeople. But he couldn't escape the whispers, the sideways glances, the way conversations stopped when he entered a room. One morning, as Jake was filing reports in his office, he heard a commotion outside. He stepped onto the porch to find a young man, barely out of his teens, standing in the street. The youth's hand hovered near a low-slung gun belt. "Sheriff Hawkins," the young man called, his voice trembling slightly. "I've come to challenge you to prove I'm faster." Jake sighed, recognizing the look in the boy's eyes, the same misguided ambition that had driven so many to early graves. "Son, go home. There's no glory in gunfighting, only blood and regret." But the young man wasn't alone. Over the next few days, more gunslingers arrived, each hoping to make a name for themselves by challenging the legendary Lightning Hawkins. The town council called an emergency meeting. "Sheriff," Mayor Thompson said, his face grave, "these gunslingers are disrupting our peace. Maybe it would be best if you took a leave of absence." Jake felt a pang of hurt, but he understood their concern. His presence was putting the town at risk, the very thing he had sworn to prevent. As night fell over Redemption Creek, Jake found himself at a crossroads. The peaceful life he had sought seemed further away than ever. The legend of Lightning Hawkins had been reborn, but at what cost? Jake knew he had a decision to make, one that would affect not just his own future, but the future of Redemption Creek and everyone in it. As he watched the sun set on another day, he wondered if there was a way to reconcile the man he had been with, the man he wanted to be. The reckoning had come, not just for Jake Hawkins, but for the very idea of what it meant to be a true protector of the peace. As Jake pondered his next move, he received an unexpected visitor. It was Martha, the school teacher, her eyes filled with determination. "Sheriff," she said, "I have an idea. Why don't you teach us, all of us, how to defend ourselves? Not to be gunslingers, but to be protectors of our home." Jake considered her words carefully. Perhaps this was the way to bridge his past and present, not by running from his skills, but by using them to empower others. The next day, Jake announced the formation of the Redemption Creek Citizens Guard. It was time for Lightning Hawkins to become not just a legend but a teacher. The Citizens Guard started small, just a handful of volunteers meeting in the town square. But as word spread, more and more townsfolk joined in. Jake stood before them, feeling a mix of pride and trepidation. "All right, folks," he began, "we're not here to create an army. We're here to learn how to protect our homes and each other." He started with the basics: situational awareness, de-escalation techniques, and only then moved on to handling firearms safely. Jake was surprised to find that teaching came naturally to him. He took as much pride in seeing a shopkeeper learn to stand confidently as he once had in outdrawing an opponent. As the weeks passed, the changes in Redemption Creek became evident. The townsfolk walked taller, their eyes more alert but less fearful. The number of barroom brawls dropped significantly as potential troublemakers found themselves facing not just the sheriff, but a united community. One evening, as Jake was locking up the office, he spotted young Billy practicing his stance in the street. "Remember, Billy," Jake called out, "a gun is a last resort. Your best weapon is up here." He tapped his temple. Billy nodded eagerly. "Yes, sir. Ma says since you started teaching us, she feels safer than she ever has." Jake felt a warmth in his chest at the boy's words. This was what he had always wanted, to protect people not through fear, but by empowering them. But not everyone was pleased with the changes. Jake noticed Tom, his deputy, growing increasingly distant and resentful. "Is this really necessary, Sheriff?" Tom asked one day, gesturing to the townspeople practicing in the square. "Isn't it our job to protect them?" Jake placed a hand on Tom's shoulder. "Our job is to serve them, Tom, and sometimes the best way to do that is to help them stand on their own." As the sun set on another day of training, Jake realized that he was no longer just Lightning Hawkins, the feared gunslinger, or even just the sheriff. He had become something new, a guardian, a teacher, a leader. And for the first time in years, he felt truly at peace with who he was. The legend of Lightning Hawkins was being rewritten, not as a tale of lone heroism, but as a story of community empowerment. Jake knew there would be challenges ahead, but he was ready to face them, not alone, but with the strength of an entire town behind him. As he watched the people of Redemption Creek, shopkeepers and farmers now standing tall with newfound confidence, Jake knew he had found his true calling. The path ahead was uncertain, but one thing was clear. The future of Redemption Creek was brighter than ever. As autumn painted Redemption Creek in shades of gold and red, a chill wind brought more than just fallen leaves to the town. Jake was in the middle of a training session when he spotted a dust cloud on the horizon. Riders approaching fast. "Everyone, positions!" Jake called out calmly. The townsfolk moved with practiced efficiency, taking cover and readying themselves. But as the riders drew closer, Jake's hand, which had been hovering near his holster, dropped to his side. He recognized the lead rider. It was his old partner. From his martial days, Marcus Deadeye Johnson. "Jake," Marcus called out as he reined in his horse, "we need your help. The Blackwater Gang is heading this way, and they're out for blood." The Blackwater Gang. Jake felt a cold knot in his stomach. They were the ones who had finally convinced him to hang up his guns after a bloody shootout that had left too many good men dead. As Marcus explained the situation, Jake could see the fear in the eyes of the townsfolk. They had faced danger before, but this was different. The Blackwater Gang was infamous for their cruelty and their skill with guns. "We'll help," Jake said finally, "but we do this my way. No unnecessary bloodshed." Marcus looked skeptical. "You're away, Jake. These aren't some two-bit outlaws. They're killers, and we're protectors," Jake replied firmly. He turned to address the gathered crowd. "Folks, this is what we've been training for. Not to seek out violence, but to defend our home when trouble comes calling." As the town prepared for the coming storm, Jake retreated to his office. He opened a locked drawer and pulled out a worn leather gun belt, the one he had sworn never to wear again. Tom found him there, staring at the belt. "Sheriff?" he asked hesitantly. "Are you really going to put that on again?" Jake looked up, his eyes filled with resolve. "Sometimes, Tom, to protect the peace, we have to be ready for war." As he buckled on the gun belt, Jake knew that the true test of Redemption Creek and of his own redemption was about to begin. The Blackwater Gang wasn't just another group of outlaws. They were a reminder of everything Jake had tried to leave behind. That night, as the town prepared for the coming battle, Jake stood alone on the church tower, watching the distant horizon. The weight of the gun belt felt both familiar and strange, a reminder of the man he used to be and the man he had become. Marcus joined him, his face etched with concern. "You've built something special here, Jake. These people, they're not just hiding behind you. They're standing with you." Jake nodded, his eyes still on the horizon. "That's what worries me, Marcus. They're brave, but bravery isn't enough against the Blackwater Gang. I can't lose them. Not like we lost our men in that last shootout." Marcus placed a hand on Jake's shoulder. "We're not the same men we were then, Jake, and neither are they." He gestured to the town below, where the citizens of Redemption Creek were preparing for battle with grim determination. As the first light of dawn broke over the hills, Jake made his decision. He would face the Blackwater Gang, not as Lightning Hawkins, the lone gunslinger, but as Sheriff Hawkins, the leader of a community united in its own defense. The echoes of the past were loud, but the voices of the present, of Martha, Billy, Tom, and all the others who had placed their trust in him, were louder. Whatever came, they would face it together. The legend of Lightning Hawkins was about to face its greatest test, not in a blaze of gunfire, but in the courage and unity of an entire town. The next few days in Redemption Creek were a flurry of activity. Jake worked tirelessly, coordinating defenses and running drills with the Citizens Guard. The air was thick with tension, but also a steely determination. Marcus watched the preparations with a mix of admiration and skepticism. "I've got to hand it to you, Jake," he said, shaking his head. "I've never seen civilians move like this. But are you sure they're ready for what's coming?" Jake's eyes scanned the town, taking in the barricades, the lookout posts, the carefully planned fields of fire. They're not just civilians anymore, Marcus. They're defenders, and they're fighting for their homes. As the sun began to set on the third day, a young boy came running into town, his horse lathered and panting. "They're coming," he gasped. "The Blackwater gang. I saw them at Carson's Ridge." Jake's voice rang out clear and strong. "Everyone to your positions. Remember your training." The town seemed to hold its breath as the thunder of approaching hooves grew louder. Jake took his position in the center of Main Street, Marcus at his side. "Just like old times, eh, partner?" Marcus grinned, but Jake could see the nervousness in his eyes. "Not quite," Jake replied. "This time we're not alone." As the first riders appeared at the edge of town, Jake's hand hovered near his holster. He could feel the eyes of every person in Redemption Creek on him, waiting for his signal. The leader of the Blackwater gang, a man with a face like weathered leather and eyes as cold as ice, reined in his horse. "Well, well," he drawled, "if it ain't Lightning Hawkins himself. Heard you'd gone soft, playing sheriff in this little mud hole." Jake's voice was steady as he replied, "Turn around and ride out, Blackwater. This town is under my protection." The gang leader's laugh was like gravel. "Protection? You and what army, Hawkins?" Jake allowed himself a small smile. "Not an army," he said. "Something much stronger." At his signal, the defenders of Redemption Creek revealed themselves. From rooftops, windows, and carefully concealed positions, the citizens stood tall, weapons at the ready. The Blackwater gang found themselves facing not just one legendary gunslinger, but an entire town prepared to fight for their home. As both sides tensed for the coming battle, Jake knew that the next few moments would determine not just the fate of Redemption Creek, but the legacy of Lightning Hawkins himself. The air crackled with tension as both sides faced each other down. Jake could feel the weight of the moment, the lives hanging in the balance. This wasn't just about him anymore. It was about every man, woman, and child in Redemption Creek who had put their trust in him. "Last chance, Blackwater," Jake called. "Out. Leave now, and no one has to get hurt." The gang leader's face twisted in rage. "Kill them all," he roared, spurring his horse forward. What followed would be remembered in Redemption Creek for generations. The Blackwater gang charged, guns blazing, but they found no easy prey. Instead, they rode into a carefully prepared defense. Jake moved, like lightning, his shots ringing out with deadly precision. But he wasn't fighting alone. All around him, the people of Redemption Creek held their ground, their training and determination shining through. The battle had begun, and with it, the true test of everything Jake had built in Redemption Creek. The legend of Lightning Hawkins was about to be rewritten, not by a lone gunslinger, but by an entire community united in its own defense. The battle raged through the streets of Redemption Creek, the air filled with gunsmoke and the sharp crack of gunfire. Jake moved like a force of nature, his shots precise and devastating, but he wasn't fighting alone. All around him, the people of Redemption Creek held their ground. Martha, the school teacher, picked off riders with surprising accuracy from her position in the church tower. Old Man Johnson and his sons created a wall of gunfire from behind overturned wagons. Even young Billy played his part, running messages between positions with fearless determination. The Blackwater gang, for all their reputation, found themselves outmaneuvered and outgunned. They had expected to face a town cowering in fear. Instead, they met a community united in purpose. As the battle raged, Jake spotted the gang leader trying to flank their position. With a nod to Marcus, he set off in pursuit. The two men faced each other in the dusty street, guns drawn. It was a scene straight out of Jake's past. The legendary Lightning Hawkins in a showdown, but this time it was different. This time he wasn't fighting for glory or reputation. He was fighting for something more. "It's over, Blackwater," Jake said, his voice steady. "Your men are beaten. Surrender now." Blackwater's laugh was harsh. "You've gone soft, Hawkins. The Lightning I knew wouldn't hesitate to pull the trigger." Jake's eyes never wavered. That man is gone. I'm something. Else now, something better. In a flash, Blackwater went for his gun, but Jake was faster. He'd always been faster. His shot rang out, striking Blackwater's hand, sending his weapon spinning into the dust. As Jake moved to disarm the fallen gang leader, he heard the cheers erupting around him. The battle was over. Redemption Creek had won. But as the adrenaline faded, Jake knew that the true test was just beginning. They had defended their home, but at what cost? And could a town that had taken up arms ever truly return to peace? As the dust settled, Jake surveyed the aftermath. The town had suffered damage, but the spirit of its people remained unbroken. He watched as neighbors helped neighbors, tending to the wounded and beginning the process of rebuilding. Marcus approached, a look of wonder on his face. "I've never seen anything like it, Jake. These people, they fought like seasoned warriors." Jake nodded, a mix of pride and concern in his eyes. "They fought for their homes, Marcus. That's a powerful motivator." As the day wore on, Jake found himself reflecting on the journey that had brought him to this point. He had come to Redemption Creek seeking peace, trying to leave behind the violent life of Lightning Hawkins. Instead, he had found a different kind of peace, one built not on the absence of conflict, but on the strength of a community united. The legend of Lightning Hawkins had indeed been rewritten. But it was no longer the story of a lone gunslinger. It was the tale of a man who had found his true calling in empowering others, in building something greater than himself. As the sun set on Redemption Creek, Jake knew that their challenges were far from over. The world would hear of what had happened here, and others would come seeking to test their mettle against the town that had defeated the Blackwater gang. But whatever came, Jake was certain of one thing: Redemption Creek would face it together. The spirit of community that had been forged in the heat of battle would not fade easily, and in that unity they would find their strength. The legend of Lightning Hawkins lived on, not in the speed of his draw or the accuracy of his shots, but in the courage and determination of every citizen of Redemption Creek. And that, Jake realized, was a legacy worth fighting for. In the weeks that followed the battle with the Blackwater gang, Redemption Creek underwent a transformation that went far beyond repairing bullet holes and rebuilding fences. There was a new energy in the town, a sense of pride and purpose that touched every aspect of life. Jake watched with quiet satisfaction as the Citizens Guard evolved. What had started as a necessity for defense became a cornerstone of the community. Training sessions now included not just marksmanship, but first aid, firefighting, and other vital skills. "You've built something special here, Jake," Marcus said one afternoon as they watched a group of townspeople practicing their aim. "Never thought I'd see the day when Lightning Hawkins was teaching folks not to use their guns." Jake chuckled. "Times change, old friend. We all have to adapt." But not everyone was thrilled with the new Redemption Creek. Jake noticed Tom, his deputy, growing increasingly distant and resentful. "Is this really what you want, Sheriff?" Tom confronted him one day. "A town full of vigilantes. What's the point of having a lawman if everyone's playing sheriff?" Jake placed a hand on Tom's shoulder. "They're not vigilantes, Tom. They're citizens taking responsibility for their community. Our job isn't to control them, it's to guide them." As autumn turned to winter, Redemption Creek faced new challenges. The notoriety brought by their stand against the Blackwater gang had put them on the map. New settlers arrived daily, drawn by tales of the town that stood up to outlaws. With growth came growing pains. Jake found himself mediating disputes, helping integrate newcomers, and constantly reinforcing the principles of community and responsibility that had seen them through their darkest hour. One cold morning, as Jake sipped coffee on the porch of the sheriff's office, he spotted young Billy leading a group of children in mock patrol formations. The sight brought a smile to his face and a warmth to his heart that had nothing to do with the coffee. Redemption Creek had changed him as much as he had changed it. The ghosts of his past no longer haunted him. Lightning Hawkins wasn't gone, but he had been transformed, just like the town he now called home. As the first snow of winter began to fall, Jake looked out over Redemption Creek with a sense of peace he had never known as a gunslinger. He had found his true calling not in the speed of his draw, but in the strength of the community he had helped build. The legend of Lightning Hawkins would live on, not as a tale of lone heroism, but as a story of transformation, redemption, and the power of people united in a common cause. 5 years had passed since the day the Blackwater gang rode into Redemption Creek. The town had grown, prospered, and become a model for communities across the West. Visitors came from far and wide to see the place where citizens and lawmen worked hand in hand to create a true haven in the wild frontier. Jake Hawkins, his hair now streaked with grey, stood on the porch of the sheriff's office, watching the bustling main street with pride. The ghosts of his past had long since faded, replaced by the joy of seeing a community thrive. "Sheriff?" called a familiar voice. It was Billy, no longer the eager boy, but a young man wearing a deputy's badge. "Got a telegram from the governor. They want to know if you'll consider training other towns in the Citizens Guard program." Jake smiled. The idea that had been born out of desperate need had grown into something much bigger. "Tell them we'd be happy to share what we've learned, Billy, but remind them it's not about creating an army, it's about building a community." As the day wore on, Jake found himself reflecting on the journey that had brought him here. He thought of the gunslinger he had once been, the reluctant sheriff he had become, and the leader he had grown into. That evening, the town gathered for its annual Founders' Day celebration. As Jake took the stage to speak, he looked out over the sea of faces, old friends who had stood with him against the Blackwater gang, newcomers who had been drawn by Redemption Creek's reputation, children who had grown up knowing only a town of peace and unity. "Friends," Jake began, his voice carrying across the square. 5 years ago we faced a threat that could have destroyed us, but instead of breaking, we became stronger. We learned that true safety doesn't come from a fast gun or a tall wall. It comes from standing together, from looking out for each other, from building something worth protecting." A cheer went up from the crowd. Jake raised his hand, calling for quiet. The legend of Lightning Hawkins used to be about one man with a quick draw, but that legend has been rewritten. Now it's the story of all of us, of a town that chose to become its own hero. As the celebration continued into the night, Jake stood at the edge of the crowd, watching the joy on the faces of his friends and neighbors. Marcus appeared at his side, a grin on his weathered face. "Not bad for a retired gunslinger," Marcus chuckled. "You've built quite a legacy here, Jake." Jake nodded, his eyes on the future generation of Redemption Creek playing and laughing in the square. "We've built it together, old friend, all of us." As the stars came out over Redemption Creek, Jake Hawkins, once the most feared gunslinger in the West, now the beloved sheriff and teacher, felt a peace he had never known in his younger days. He had found his true calling not in the power of his gun, but in the strength of his community. The legend of Lightning Hawkins would live on, not as a tale of lone heroism, but as a story of redemption, transformation, and the enduring power of people united in a common cause. And in Redemption Creek, that legend would be lived out every day by every citizen for generations to come. The success of Redemption Creek's Citizens Guard program didn't go unnoticed. Word spread across the territory, and soon other towns were seeking Jake's guidance. One crisp autumn morning, Jake found himself addressing a group of sheriffs and mayors from neighboring communities. "The key," he explained, "is to empower your people. Don't just protect them, teach them to protect themselves and each other." As Jake's ideas spread, they faced resistance from those who preferred the old Ways. Some lawmen saw the Citizens' Guard as a threat to their authority. Others feared arming civilians would lead to chaos. Jake worked tirelessly to address these concerns, traveling to skeptical towns and demonstrating the benefits of community-based protection. He emphasized that the goal wasn't to create vigilantes, but to foster a sense of shared responsibility for safety and peace. Back in Redemption Creek, the town continued to evolve. The Citizens' Guard expanded its role, not just focusing on defense, but also on community service. Guard members could be seen helping build houses, teaching at the school, and organizing community events. As Jake watched his idea take root and grow, he felt a sense of pride unlike anything he'd experienced in his gunslinger days. He was no longer just protecting people. He was helping them build a better future for themselves. The impact of Redemption Creek's model began to show in surprising ways. Crime rates in neighboring towns dropped as communities became more engaged in their own protection. The West, long known for its lawlessness, was seeing pockets of stability and cooperation emerge. Jake's reputation grew, but not as a fearsome gunslinger. Instead, he became known as a visionary, a man who could turn troubled towns into thriving communities. Invitations poured in from across the territory, asking Jake to speak, consult, and help implement similar programs. As Redemption Creek's influence spread, Jake realized that his legacy would be far greater than he had ever imagined. The legend of Lightning Hawkins was fading, replaced by the story of a man who had found a way to bring peace to the frontier, not through force, but through unity and shared purpose. One evening, as Jake watched the sun set over the town he had come to love, he felt a deep sense of contentment. The path hadn't been easy, but it had led to something truly remarkable. Redemption Creek had become more than just a safe haven. It was a beacon of hope for the entire West. As Redemption Creek's reputation grew, so did the challenges it faced. The town's success attracted not just honest settlers, but also those looking to exploit its newfound prosperity. Jake found himself dealing with a new breed of troublemaker: con men, crooked businessmen, and politicians seeking to gain control of the town's growing influence. One particularly difficult case involved a charismatic businessman named Silas Greaves. Greaves arrived in town with grand promises of economic development, but Jake sensed something was amiss. As Jake investigated, he uncovered a complex scheme to defraud the townspeople. But Greaves was clever, always staying just within the bounds of the law. This situation tested Jake in ways his gunslinging days never had. He couldn't solve this problem with a fast draw. Instead, he had to rely on the very community he had helped build. Working with the Citizens' Guard and Town Council, Jake organized a campaign to educate the townspeople about Greaves' true intentions. It was a battle of wits and words, fought not with guns, but with information and solidarity. The investigation led Jake down a rabbit hole of corrupt officials and backdoor deals that stretched far beyond Redemption Creek. He realized that the town's success had made it a target for those who saw the West as a place to be exploited rather than nurtured. As the truth about Greaves came to light, the town rallied behind Jake. Shopkeepers refused to do business with Greaves' companies. The local newspaper, run by Martha's sister, published exposés on his past frauds. Even Billy and his young friends played a part, keeping watch on Greaves' movements and reporting any suspicious activities. The final confrontation came not in a gunfight, but in a town hall meeting. Jake laid out all the evidence, and the citizens of Redemption Creek made their choice clear. Greaves and his cronies were run out of town, not by force, but by the united will of a community that refused to be victimized. In the end, it was the united front of the community that drove Greaves out of town. This victory showed Jake that the true strength of Redemption Creek lay not in weapons, but in the bonds between its people. The Greaves incident, however, had exposed vulnerabilities in the town's governance. Jake realized that for redemption, Creak to truly thrive, it needed more than just physical protection. It needed a robust system of checks and balances to guard against corruption and exploitation. Working with the town council, Jake helped establish new transparency measures and ethical guidelines for all town officials. He encouraged citizens to become more involved in local politics, emphasizing that true democracy required active participation from everyone. These changes weren't always easy. Some longtime residents resisted, comfortable with the old ways of doing things. Jake found himself mediating heated debates and smoothing ruffled feathers as the town grappled with its evolving identity. Through it all, Jake's steady leadership and unwavering commitment to the community's well-being kept Redemption Creek on course. He reminded everyone that change, while often uncomfortable, was necessary for growth and progress. As the dust settled from these internal struggles, Redemption Creek emerged stronger than ever. The town had proven that it could face threats, not just from outside, but from within as well. Jake's role, too, had evolved. He was no longer just the protector of the town, but its guide and conscience. The legend of Lightning Hawkins, the fearsome gunslinger, had been completely overshadowed by the reality of Jake Hawkins, the man who had taught a town to believe in itself. As he watched Redemption Creek navigate these new challenges, Jake felt a deep sense of pride. The town had grown beyond his wildest dreams, and he knew that whatever the future held, Redemption Creek would face it with courage, integrity, and unity. As years passed, Jake began to think about the future of Redemption Creek beyond his own tenure as sheriff. He knew that for the town's unique approach to community and safety to endure, he needed to pass on his knowledge and values to the next generation. Jake started a mentorship program, taking promising young members of the Citizens Guard under his wing. Among them was Sarah, the daughter of Martha the schoolteacher, who showed a natural talent for leadership and problem-solving. Under Jake's guidance, Sarah and her peers learned not just the practical skills of law enforcement, but also the importance of compassion, community engagement, and ethical decision-making. Jake watched with pride as these young leaders began to take on more responsibility in the town. They brought fresh ideas and energy to the Citizens Guard while still respecting the core principles that had made Redemption Creek special. A day, as Jake observed Sarah mediating a dispute between neighbors with wisdom beyond her years, he realized that the true legacy of Lightning Hawkins wouldn't be the tales of his gunfighting days. It would be the continuation of the values and community spirit he had helped instill in Redemption Creek, carried forward by those who would come after him. As he approached his 60th birthday, Jake began to seriously consider retirement. The thought no longer filled him with dread, as it once had. Instead, he felt a sense of satisfaction, knowing that he had helped shape a generation of leaders who would carry Redemption Creek into the future. In a quiet moment, Jake found himself talking with Billy, now a respected deputy and family man himself. "You know, Billy," Jake said, "I used to think my legacy would be how fast I could draw a gun. Now I know it's how well I've taught others to keep the peace without ever needing to draw." Billy nodded, understanding the weight of Jake's words. "You've taught us all that, Sheriff, and we'll make sure to pass it on to our kids, too." As the sun set on another day in Redemption Creek, Jake looked out over the town he had helped build. The legend of Lightning Hawkins had faded into history, replaced by something far more enduring, a community that understood the true meaning of justice, compassion, and unity. Jake knew that whatever challenges the future might bring, Redemption Creek would face them with the strength and wisdom of its people, and in that knowledge, he found a peace that no amount of gun-slinging glory could ever have provided. On a warm, summer evening, 10 years after the fateful day when escaped prisoners had targeted Redemption Creek, Jake Hawkins stood on the porch of the sheriff's office, watching the sun set over the town he had come to love. The streets were alive with the sounds of laughter and music as the town celebrated its annual Founders' Day festival. Children played games their parents had invented, inspired by tales of the Citizens Guard's training exercises. Visitors from across the territory mingled with locals, all drawn by Redemption Creek's reputation as a model of community and progress. As Jake surveyed the scene, he felt a deep sense of contentment. The ghosts of his past as Lightning Hawkins no longer haunted him. Instead, he saw his legacy in the thriving town before him, in the confident stride of the Citizens Guard members, and in the eyes of the children who grew up knowing they were part of something special. Sarah, now a respected leader in her own right, approached Jake with a smile. "Thinking deep thoughts, Sheriff?" Jake chuckled. "Just appreciating how far we've come, and thinking it might be time for this old gunslinger to hang up his badge for good." Sarah's eyes widened. "Are you sure?" Jake nodded, his gaze sweeping over the town once more. "Redemption Creek doesn't need Lightning Hawkins anymore. It has something far stronger. A community that stands together, come what may." As the festival continued into the night, Jake Hawkins, once the most feared gunslinger in the West, now the beloved architect of a unique community, felt a peace he had never known in his younger days. He had found his true calling, not in the power of his gun, but in the strength of the community he had helped build. The legend of Lightning Hawkins would live on, not as a tale of lone heroism, but as a story of redemption, transformation, and the enduring power of people united in a common cause. And in Redemption Creek, that legend would be lived out every day by every citizen for generations to come. As the last light faded from the sky, Jake took one final look at the badge he had worn for so many years. With a smile, he unpinned it and handed it to Sarah. "It's your turn now," he said softly. "Keep them safe. Keep them united." Sarah took the badge with reverence, understanding the weight of the responsibility it represented. "I will," she promised. "We all will." Jake Hawkins walked into the twilight, not as a gunslinger riding off into the sunset, but as a man who had found his home and his purpose. The story of Lightning Hawkins had come full circle, ending not with a bang, but with the quiet strength of a community that would stand the test of time. And so, as Redemption Creek continued to grow and thrive, the legend of the gunslinger who became a peacemaker lived on, a testament to the power of redemption and the enduring strength of a community united in hope and purpose.